Okay, in the next few minutes, I want to do a crash review of Greek participles and their forms. So let's get started. What are participles? Well, we can start by thinking of them as ing words. For example, take this sentence. Walking down the street, I saw Jane. Walking is the participle. I've highlighted I because walking is telling you, it relates to I. It's while I was walking down the street that I saw Jane. Now it could have been flipped. It could be I saw Jane walking down the street, in which case walking would have been about Jane maybe. But you can see that walking relates to a noun, or in this case a pronoun, I. Here's another example. I saw a burnt cake. In Greek, you might translate this. I saw a having been burnt cake. Burnt is telling you something about the cake. What am I getting at? Participles are verbal adjectives. They tell us about nouns or pronouns in a verbal kind of way. So walking tells us about I in a verbal kind of way. I, walking down the street, saw Jane. Or here, cake, a cake having been burnt. What kind of a cake is it? It's a having been burnt cake. And so participles are adjectives of a sort that have a verbal quality to them. Okay? Because they're part verb, Greek participles will have tense and they will have voice. And because they're part adjective, participles in Greek will have case, number, and gender. Okay? This is why they're so complex, because they're part verb, part adjective, which means that there are a lot of aspects to them. And every aspect to a participle tells you something about the meaning and the translation. Okay, so we can start by thinking of participles as ing words. There are 3 steps I talk about to translate a Greek participle. 3 steps. The first step is to start off with the ing form. Sometimes you can leave it in its ing form and it's just fine. Sometimes this is good enough. But basically, the ing form, this is again for a starter translation, which we then go on to perfect in many cases. Especially if the NIV, if Zondervan calls us and says we're making a new translation, then you're going to need to learn how to go beyond this step 1 form. But for beginning Greek, we can start with this step 1. So if it's a present active participle, try the ing form of the word, like walking. If it's a present passive participle, try being something. So being masked. Would be a present passive participle. If it's an aorist active participle, try having something. And if it's an aorist passive participle, try having been something. Having been burnt, for example, might be an aorist passive participle. You can see that the passives have being and been, whereas the actives are more active. So that's the starter translation, the ing form. Sometimes you can stop there. Step 2 is what I've sometimes called Ken's rule, although I'm sure I plagiarized it from somewhere. I didn't plagiarize it because I'm telling you. But basically, does the participle have the article? This is the next thing to look for. If it does, then it's definitely what's called an adjectival participle. And you're going to use a who if it's a person, or a that if it's something else. You're going to put that in front of the ing form, or in front of the participle translation if it has the article. Because then it's going to be used either attributively or substantively, and you're going to use a who or that in order to translate it. If the participle doesn't have the article, now actually, technically, it could still be adjectival without the article. You're going to have to use your common sense. If a who or a that really fits, then it can still be adjectival even if it doesn't have the article. But if it doesn't have the article, try a while or an after. If it's a present participle, try while. Or if it's an aorist participle, try after. There are, of course, other adverbial options, because, if, although. These are other kinds of adverbial participles. Adverbial participles are where, even though it relates to a noun or pronoun in the sentence, it's especially telling you about the verb. So while tells you the timing of the verb. Because tells you the condition or the cause of the verb, or if tells you the condition of the verb. But so let me summarize what I've just said here in a simple rule. Step 2, if the participle has the article, use who or that. If it doesn't, use while or after. Now, there are lots of other possibilities, but that'll get you going in beginning Greek. If the participle has the article, use who or that. If it doesn't, try while or after. Okay? Now, there's also another option called periphrastic, like Ken is teaching. There's going to be a form of the verb to be, like is, and then you're going to have an ing word like teaching. Not that difficult. Usually, a periphrastic is going to you're going to translate it naturally just by translating the words. But the step 2 has to do with finding out what kind of a participle it is. Is it being used adjectivally? If so, then who or that. If it has a noun with it, it's attributive. If it doesn't, it's substantive. And if it's substantive, you're going to have to come up with a noun, something like the one who is walking, or something like that. So, is it an adjectival participle? Is it a adverbial participle? In which case, it's telling you about the verb, and you're going to use an option like while, or after, or because, or if, or although, or one of the other possibilities. Sometimes when it's adverbial, you can just leave it in the ing form, and it's just fine. Third option is periphrastic, and that's where it's being used with some form of the verb to be, like is, are, will be, or something like that. And I think in another video I've gone into periphrastics. This is meant to be a review, so I'm hoping you've read something or had lectures beyond what I'm talking about here. Okay, step 1, get the ing form, get it on the board. Step 2, figure out what kind of participle it is. Is it adjectival? Is it adverbial? Is it periphrastic? And then step 3 is clean up on aisle 4. And by clean up, I mean, first of all, make sure you know what the participle is connected to. And case number and gender tells you that. If the case number and gender of the participle is dative singular masculine, then the participle is relating to something that's dative singular masculine in the sentence. There is something called a genitive absolute, which is when the participle isn't related to anything in the sentence, and so the Greeks had to come up with some case to put it in. So when a participial phrase is grammatically unconnected to the rest of the sentence, the Greeks took a noun and put it in the genitive, took the participle and put it in the genitive, and that became its own little world. The noun or pronoun in the genitive becomes the subject of the participial phrase, and the participle becomes the verb. So if you have something like Ken teaching, the moon blew up. Ken would be in the genitive and teaching would be in the genitive, because Ken teaching is grammatically unrelated to the moon blowing up. That's called a genitive absolute. Again, hopefully this is a review. But if you're trying to learn Greek on your own, then just stick to the high points. So who is the participle about? Make sure you're connecting it. Remember that sentence way back at the very beginning of this video where I said, walking down the street, I saw Jane. If walking is, okay, I'm masculine singular, and in this sentence nominative if it's I. So if walking is nominative masculine singular, then it's telling me about I, because I am nominative masculine singular. But let's say that walking was feminine accusative singular. Then it would be telling me about Jane, because in this sentence I saw Jane. Jane is accusative, she's feminine, and she's singular. So again, the third step where you're doing cleanup on aisle 4, first of all, you want to connect the participle with the right noun in the sentence. What does it match in case number and gender? And then the timing. Get the timing straight. So in general, an aorist participle happens before the main verb. It's relative time, not absolute time. Or if you have a that's why we say if you have an aorist participle, use after, because then the participle is happening before the main verb. And if you have a main verb that's past tense and a participle that's past tense, like aorist participle, aorist main verb, use had in your translation to push the translation even further into the past. Okay, a lot of detail there. What's the big picture of translating participles? Step 1, get the ing form on the board. 2, if it has the article, use who or that. If it doesn't, you can just stick with the ing form, or you might try a while or after. 3, clean up. Make sure you know who the participle's talking about, because of the case number and gender, and then make sure that the timing's right. A lot of this is common sense. You're going to clean it up intuitively once you get the hang of it. Okay, so that's all about a review, a crash review of how to translate participles. Now, how do we recognize participles? Well, the nominatives of participles mostly have to be memorized, and I'm sorry, there is a song. But for example, here are the present active nominatives. The masculine luon. So you should kind of learn luon as your very first participle you memorized. That's a masculine nominative singular present active participle. Usa is the nominative feminine singular present active participle. And then the neuter, sometimes the neuter is either the same as the masculine but with a nu, or in this case the neuter is a downgraded omega. So omega is long and omicron is short, and so the only difference between the masculine and the neuter is that the neuter has been shortened. Okay, here are the most important other nominatives to know. So lusas is the aorist active nominative masculine singular. Luthes is the aorist passive nominative masculine singular, and then lelukos is the nominative masculine singular perfect active. So there is a song which I'm not sure how helpful it is because, but all of the nominatives, Rory Skelly put them into a ridiculous song that goes like this. These are all the nominative singulars in all the genders for all the tenses and voices. Luon, usa, an, amenas, amene, amenan. Lusas, sasa, san, samenas, samene, samenan. Luthes, thesa, then, lelukos, quiacas, lelumenas, mene, menan. And for my classes, I have given you a sheet with all of those on them. Okay, let me move on. So you recognize the nominatives, largely by memorizing them, and I've given you the nominatives that you most have to memorize on this PowerPoint slide. So nominatives, you mostly just have to memorize them. More participle indicators. So I have some stupid cliches. Here's my first stupid cliche. My aunt is an active participle. And so if you have this aunt, also aunt for the aorist, or ent for the aorist passive, any of these unts kind of tell you that you're looking at an active participle, maybe. I mean, there's no perfect, I'm going to mess you up somewhere else by giving you this cliche to help you with participles. But in general, if you have this unt and it has other letters after it, then probably it's a participle. I can think of one exception, but I'm going to move on. Men are passive or middle participles. So when you have a men with ending after it, don't confuse this with the first person plural. But if it has other ending stuff after the men, then it's probably a passive or middle participle. And then this is the most complex one. Active feminines carry uzis and are sassy. That us and sas we're going to see with feminine participles. So if you remember back here, usa, this is what I mean. Usa is the nominative feminine singular participle. Okay, I'm trying to give you some cliches to help you recognize. So these help you recognize, these cliches help you recognize that you're looking at a participle and also help you with the voice, right? So aunt and aunt here, these are active kinds of connectors. Men is a middle or passive connector, and then us and sas are active feminine connectors. Again, these are things to help you recognize and parse a participle. How do you recognize tense in a participle? Good news. You recognize tense in a participle pretty much the same way you recognize any tense, and that is by knowing the stems. Remember, luo, luso, elusa, leluca, lelumai, eluthane. The principal parts of a verb tell you what the tense indicators are. So if nothing's done to the stem, then it's a present participle. There is no imperfect participle, okay? Good news. No imperfect participle. There actually is a future participle. It just adds a sigma to the present. But I'm going to say there isn't one. Okay, let's say there isn't a future participle, even though there is. It just adds a sigma to the present. Aorist, active, and middle participles are going to have a sa. But I knew that, right? Here is something different. There are no augments. Once you leave the indicative mood, augments are out the window. There is no augment in a participle. There is no augment in an infinitive. There is no augment in a subjunctive. There is no augment in an imperative. There is no augment in an optative. Augments are out the window once we leave the indicative mood. By the way, also the word not, may, the mu, eta, that word for not is used in the New Testament with participles rather than u. Okay, no augments. So aorist, active, and middle are going to have a sigma alpha just like other aorist, active, and middles. The aorist passive is theta epsilon as its tense suffix, the thing tacked onto the end of the stem. It's not theta eta, which is what I would have wanted it to be, but it's a theta epsilon. I can deal with it. Eta is a long epsilon, so okay, fine. The perfect is going to reduplicate. So perfect participles are going to reduplicate just like any other perfect. Perfect active is going to put a kappa at the end. Unfortunately, not a kappa alpha, but it's going to have reduplication on the front with a kappa. Anyway, that helps. And then perfect middle or passive participle, again, is going to shove the ending right onto the stem with no connecting vowel. And it's going to have the reduplication. So the tense indicators are the same for a participle as they are for any other verb. Okay, so we've got cliches. Okay, so how are we going to recognize participle? We're going to memorize the nominatives, especially these. How are we going to memorize or recognize that it's active or middle or passive? We're going to use my aunt as an active participle, or men are passive or middle participles, or active feminine participles carry uzis and are sassy. We're going to recognize those. We're going to look for these tense indicators. Man, this is easy. So all that's left is how do I recognize the case number and gender? Well, for masculines and neuters that are active, for active participles, the masculine and neuter participle endings are going to follow the third declension, and you already know them. Are con antas, anti anta, antes anton, usi antas. These are the participle indicators, and you can see my aunt is an active participle, and so it's using third declension endings for a song I've already learned for the masculine and neuters. Of course, the neuter plural alpha is going to do an alpha there and an alpha down here, like all neuter plurals do in Greek, nominative and accusative. Okay, so enough said. So I'm going to be able to know what case number and gender these are because I know my third declensions. The active feminines, active feminine participles follow the endings of the first declension. So I don't know if you remember doxa. Doxa is mixed. Remember, doxa does alphas in the nominative and accusative, and doxa does etas in the genitive and dative. Well, here we have it. Usa, uses, usei, usan. These are first declension endings that I learned a long time ago, right? And this is the active females carry uzis. Usa, uses, usei. I tried, okay? There you have it. So the masculine and neuter, active, follow the third declension. Active feminines follow the first declension, and then the middle or passives are easy. They follow the first and second declension endings. Here they are. Asean, uesu, oeo, anenan. Asean, uesu, oeo, anenan. Oyaya, ononon, oisaisois, usasa, oyaya, ononon, oisaisois, usasa. Okay, so the middle and passive participles, at least the ones that have men are passive, remember, or middle, are going to follow the endings of the first and second declension. So actually, participles are a great review. Think of how many different songs we've reviewed in this video. So it's a grand review of a lot of stuff, which of course is participles are so complex in that sense. But at the same time, once you've got them, you've reviewed a whole lot of stuff from earlier on in Greek. Okay, I end with this example. Here is a horrid-looking participle, didakthentes. Okay, from didasco, to teach. So the ent part tells you it's a participle. Now notice that my ont is not an active participle here because the theta epsilon trumps it. Theta epsilon tells me this is aorist passive, and it trumps my little cliche that my unt is a active participle. The ent part tells you it's a participle, but the theta epsilon tells you it's an aorist passive participle. And then the os, remember, masculine and neuter participles follow the third declension. And in the third declension, the song is archon antas, anti, anta. And so os is a genitive, singular masculine ending for a masculine active participle. Okay, I don't think I put the translation here, but let me tell you what the translation is then. So it's going to be of, because it's genitive, of something, or of someone. Let's go masculine. It could be technically neuter. Of someone having, because it's aorist, been, because it's passive, taught, because it's didasco. So of someone having been taught, or of having been taught. We really need a context to know, what this, how it's translated precisely. But I know there's going to be there's going to be something related to the genitive, let's say of, and there's going to be a having because it's aorist, and been because it's passive, and taught because it's a participle. And there you have it, a crash review of both the forms and the functions of Greek participles.